Hello. Today I'll be talking about APIs, understanding APIs, and how we use them to enable communication between software applications. My name is Sai, and I'll do a quick rundown of what they are and how we use them. The definition of an API is that an API is a set of rules and protocols that allow different software applications to communicate with each other. And again, it enables the integration and interaction between different system services and applications. So an example of an API that a lot of people use today is ChatGPT. It's an example of an API that enables developers to integrate conversational AI capabilities into their applications. If you've seen different web apps that take whatever you're typing in and stream them through ChatGPT, that's an example of an API. And again, by sending text prompts to the API, developers receive generated responses based on the ChatGPT model. That's an example. So why do we need to use APIs? APIs facilitate data exchange and functionality sharing. It promotes modular development and innovation, and it supports interoperability between various platforms. Right. So, for example, a lot of times when you're in the real world, your server, right, your server and database where you're storing all of your information, it's going to be either located off-site or it could be using an entirely different service, right? You could be using AWS for your server-related needs, and to actually be able to for you to be able to communicate with the AWS backend, you're going to need to use API requests, which we'll talk about next. So, the two main types of APIs you'll see in web development is REST APIs, which stand for Representational State Transfer. They're stateless, and they use HTTP methods, which are widely used in web services. The second type is an external API, which integrates with third-party services for features like authentication. An example of this would be Auth0. For example, when you log into UTD e-learning, we use Duo to do authentication. That would be an example of an external API. So over here we have an image of just a quick graphic of how we use APIs. A lot of times we use the browser, right, as our main gateway into different services. And as soon as we go to a website, which I'll demonstrate next, we interact with a lot of APIs simultaneously. So we talked about HTTP methods in the previous slide, but really the main 4 or 5 methods would be a GET method, which retrieves data from an API, POST, which sends the data to create a new resource, PUT, which updates an existing resource, and DELETE, which removes the resource. So to really give you the context of what we use this for, you'd use a GET API when we're trying to request for a web page or an object from a server, right? So for example, if I was going to google.com, right, that creates a GET request, a GET API request to basically allow me to receive information from Google services. A put request, again, we use that to send a document to the server. So when you create a new account for a web application, or when you create a new email account, that your account details, like your username, password, and all your personal details, you could use a put request to send that document of information to a server to store. And we use a post request, which again, we send data or information about client to the server. And say you want to delete your account, or we want to delete an object, right? We can use a delete request, which deletes an object from a server. And then we have head, trace, and option, which you won't really see very much. So we use something called an endpoint, which is a URL where an API can access resources or functions, right? So an example of endpoints would be a /tasks, which could retrieve all tasks. If I'm creating an application where we're storing, like a task manager application, a GET API endpoint could retrieve our tasks. A post could create a new task and let the server know that, hey, we're creating a new task. Put can update a task, right? And over here you see that for the URL, we have task /an ID, which you could use if we're trying to send a task to a specific object in the back end, and delete, which again, if we want to delete a task. So then we have request and response structure. So when you send an API request, it's almost like sending a physical mail to someone, right? That would be a good analogy. Just like you would have like the structure of a letter, which you would have, dear so and so with the body of a letter, and then with the closing, the ending, right? We use a similar type of format for API request and response structure. So for request structure, the headers could be the content type and different authorization related information, and the body would have the actual data with the request. So going back to our analogy of creating a task, our example of creating a task manager application, the body of a API request could contain a title, which is the name of the task, a description, which includes details, and then obviously when we send a request, we need a response, right? We receive a response to an API request with a status code, right, indicating the outcome. A lot of times, if you've gone to a web page that either has been deleted or something, or the URL, or you put in the wrong URL, you can get a 404 not found error, which is pretty common. And these error codes just let you know whether the state of the API request, right? You could a lot of times you'll see 201, which stands for an object is created. And again, just like in real life, when you send a letter to somebody and you receive a response, it's usually in the same format. So you will also have a body in the response structure, which is the data returned by the API. So this could include the title of the task, the description, whether it failed or not. Again, all of these are examples of request and response structure. So authentication methods, this is a lot of times when you use a third-party authentication service. Again, an example we've all seen is Duo, which we use as part of e-learning. Again, we have something called API keys, which are keys for accessing an API. And specifically towards authentication, we have something called OAuth, which is an open standard for access. You don't really need to know too much about this now unless it's something you implement in your project. But you also have JWT, which stands for JSON Web Tokens, which are compact URL safe tokens for secure data exchange. And again, going back, we also have error handling, right? So the most common status codes for API requests would be 200, which is a success, 400, which is a bad request, 401, which is unauthorized, 404 not found, and 500 internal server error. And using this information now, next time you go to a website and you get one of these errors, right, you can use it to identify issues. And again, to actually be able to make your API request when you get to the stage when you're building the back end of your application, a really good tool to use is Postman, which allows you to send API requests, allow you to build requests, and allow you to analyze responses. Now, all that being said, I'll quickly just run through a very, very simple demo of API requests in action. So again, you can try this on your own computer or really anytime you use a website. So over here, I've navigated to google.com, and pretty much first when I type in google.com, right, you see this entire list of just tabs, information. So again, I opened this up using inspect element. So just to quickly demonstrate that, if you right click anywhere and you hit inspect and you hit go to network, right, you can start seeing the requests the web page is making. So in this case, if we remember earlier, a 200 request means that it's successful, right? So if we actually take a look at this, if I double click this, I can look at the body. Remember, the body of an API request is almost like the body of an email, right? And the header is like the subject. We can sort of think of it that way. So over here, we can see that this request, let's see here. So let's look at the request. So the request URL, it's using this endpoint. Again, an API endpoint is just a URL that's almost like a gateway to make requests. So in this case, we made a GET request, and we requested this, right? Whatever this means, whatever this means on the Google side of things, and we got a status code of 200, which is okay. That means we got that information. And then the response again, you'll see something similar. This pertains to when you like go to google.com. We sent a request to google.com, and that's the get request we're making for this piece of content. And then after that, the response we get is we get all this information about all this. So, like for example, the date, last modified, report to the server that was used, the encoding, all this type of stuff. It's not super important right now, but just for just so you all understand how this works. And again, we have multiple different types of API requests. So, for example, this is a request made by Google. So, again, we all know how Google stores a lot of information about its users. So you can sort of see kind of what information is stored when you go to google.com on your browser. So it sees here that it makes some type of request where it can see what browser I'm using. I'm using Brave browser right now, and it shows you that, as well as all the stuff related to your browser. And again, this is something called a provisional header. You don't really need to know much about that, but let's actually try making a request and see how that works. So let's hit I'm feeling lucky, and okay, and we got to this random website, and you see over here all this information is being queried, right? So when you go, so again, in this example, we went to a Google website and we got to a web page with a lot of images. All these images are being stored somewhere else in the back end of Google servers. All these images, right? And to actually be able to see the images when we query up the button we pressed, right, whatever link we went to, we have to make a lot of get requests, right? Or that's what happens. So in this case, we see a lot of 200s, right? And what's nice is, at least in this panel of network, you can see the actual images that are being loaded. So for example, for this image that's being loaded, it comes from this link, right? And over here, again, we have all this information about that. So again, the preview, and sometimes if it's an image and it's encoded properly, sometimes you can see the preview in the network panel. And to get this Google image, this is what that was queried. Again, we make a request to a server, right? That's the whole point. Because again, we're interacting with the front end. That's what you see. So when you click on something, right, and if we want the user to see some type of information, that is a request we have to make to the back end from the front end, right? Again, over here you can see all these different, again, they use JavaScript to animate a bunch of things, and again, we use get requests to actually load the scripts in from the backend server. And again, all these loaded in successfully, right? And which is good, right? And we can see the type, if it's a PNG, GIF, style sheet script, whatever it is, right? And again, we can also see the time it takes, the size, and whatnot. So again, Inspect Element is actually a great tool when you're debugging your own websites. When I was working on a web project of my own, I used this networking tab to see how fast my requests were being made, as well as if I was actually able to send those requests or not. And we can go over here, we can also see the performance and whatnot of the different requests we're making. And here we can filter. So this is just a very basic way of seeing all your to see the API requests that are being made on a website. If you would actually like to make API requests, right, on your own web server, web application that you're making, you would use the Postman tool to do so. But I think that's it. Hopefully this was helpful. Alright, so I'm going to do a quick demonstration on API endpoints in a live setting. So over here, I have VS Code pulled up, and I have a sort of template Express.js project. And again, Express is what you would typically use for the backend. So over here on the left side, if you go under routes and choose index.js, you'll pretty much be sent to the main file where you'll define your API endpoints. So over here, I have 3 API endpoints. So this first endpoint is the default API endpoint provided by Express, and this API endpoint, as we can see, this is what lets us go to the homepage, right? So over here, I have the basic Express front end pulled up, right? It says Express, welcome to Express, and this is running off of my local machine, my local IP address. It's usually port 3000 is the default one. And over here, if I try refreshing this page, right? So typically in web server, in websites and whatnot, the backslash is the root directory, right? So if you've taken systems programming in Unix, right, the root directory, the root directory is shown by a backslash. And so similarly over here, the backslash is the default page, what we call the index of a web page, and this API endpoint takes us to the index of the web page. So over here, we're doing a router, right? And this router is just the object that lets us, route different web pages. So we do router.get, and then you basically put in the endpoint, and again, an endpoint is a URL. So we don't have, since it's the homepage, right? We don't have a endpoint, or sorry, an endpoint specified. So we just put slash, and then after that, it renders the index, right, as specified, um, in the project, and that's what we see over here. And we can set the title of the website to Express. So this is the default endpoint. I created two endpoints to sort of illustrate how you can test get and post requests. I adapted these from this YouTube tutorial, which is really good. It goes over setting the stuff up. So over here, I have a get endpoint, right? And I just call this one get stuff, right? And over here, as you can see, we've taken two parameters. We have a REQ or request and a response, right? So like I mentioned earlier in the video, when we send an API request, we have a request, that's what we send, and the response is what we get back, right? So in this case, if you go to this get stuff endpoint, it'll print out to the console, oh, this endpoint has been called, and in the JSON format, it'll print out, here's the response, right? Just basic text. And again, we're specifying this with res. So res is, the request is like the input parameter that's being sent, right? So anytime you want to sort of sift through the input of a API request, you would go through REQ rec in Express. And similarly, res or response is the response which you get back. So that's what this get function does. So let's test this out. So over here, as I mentioned before, I have this application called Postman, and this Postman lets us simulate get, post, and pretty much any other request we need. Right. So we're first going to make the get request. So typically when you open Postman, it'll give you an option to create a new request. And so after you do that, you would type in the URL, right, of the request you're sending. So in this case, since we're working off of our local host, as I mentioned before, we do localhost :3000/get stuff, as that's what we specified. And over here, we have these different categories. We have params, authorization, headers, body, prerequisite scripts, test settings. So this is where you can edit the headers, right? The headers and the values that you're passing into the API request. Right now, in the GET request, we don't really need to send a request. Like we don't have to put anything in the body, right? As long as we make the request, right, we get an output for this demo. So just to do that, I'm gonna hit send, right? And over here, you can see that the message that we specified here, message : here's the response. That's what we're getting over here, right? So that's what a GET request looks like. And like we mentioned in the slides, 200 status code, as it says here. This means this was a successful HTTP request, and yes, so that's good. And then over here, when you have, assuming you're working off of VS Code for Express, when you start the server up, it'll show you the output. So that's a GET request. So in this example, it's pretty self-explanatory. But say we want to send actual data to a server to update, right? So typically, you would make requests to the server, the backend server, which is this, right? This express, and after that, that would be updated into a database, right? That's beyond the scope of this video, but just to show how you can do post requests and how to send data using Postman, we're gonna quickly look at that. So again, this is post stuff, which is just an endpoint I created. Again, it takes in a request and sends out a response. And what this does is it prints out. This will print out the request that's being sent in the body, right? And then it prints out in the response variable. This prints out that, oh, here's the response from the endpoint. So to test that out, I'm going to go into post. And then over here, this time we're actually going to go into body, right? So when you go into body, right, just like we mentioned, an API request, specifically, a post request. You can imagine it like a letter, right? When you're sending a letter to a person, you have a header and you have a body. So the headers could specify if I'm trying to send specific values to certain variables, right, that I would like to update, you could specify in the headers. But for this example, we're going to just send information in the body. And again, in the body, you can pretty much send anything you want, right? Given that you process it in the backend. So in this example, we're going to go to the body, and there's multiple ways. You can send an empty request that doesn't have a body, right? This is like an empty request. You can send form data if you're dealing with like a JavaScript form, right? You can send form URL encoded, right? And then you also have raw, which you pretty much type up what you want. And here you can specify if this is regular text, if this is JavaScript code we're sending, if this is JSON, HTML, XML, whatever. And binary, which we probably won't look at. And yeah, so that's that. So in the raw, we're going to select JSON, right? So because this example, we're just outputting whatever JSON you have. And here in the JSON, we have the user, John, and the password, 123456. Again, typically this is a very, very unsecure way of sending user credentials. So typically when if you're creating some type of login sign up system, typically you would use some type of post request to post the user credentials to a database, right? So that's sort of what we're trying to simulate over here. So if I do hit send here, okay, so it was successful, 5 milliseconds, 200. And we're saying message, and here's the response from post stuff. And if you look here in the back end, we can see over here that we got our, this is what we put in, this is what we sent. So we got our body, right, because that's what we're printing out. We're printing out the request body, right? And yeah, so that's that. Yeah. So again, this is Postman. It's good for simulating requests, and it's pretty easy to work with. But yeah, that's about it.